Hello, everyone, and welcome to this short webinar in our new series, Can Cycling and Micromobility Deliver a Modern and Sustainable City? My name is Thomas Jérémy Hayden-Lefebvre, and I'm the editor of the Green Mobility magazine, an independent publication exploring transportation, energy, and policy in a changing world. These sessions form part of our wider initiative around our recently published book by Giles Bailey, which examines how cycling and micromobility can help cities become more sustainable, livable, and economically resilient. The purpose of these webinars is to take some of the issues raised in the book and explore them in a concise and accessible manner. Each session focuses on a specific theme, and today we are actually taking a step outside of the city and focusing on rural cycling. Our goal here is to share perspectives, stimulate discussion, and I invite you to take part in this wider journey. With that, I will hand over to Giles and our guests to introduce themselves and start today's discussion.
Thank you, Thomas. So hello, everyone. My name is Giles Bailey. I'm a consultant lecturer and writer from London in the UK. And today I'll be joined by two of my colleagues, Isabel Duxfield from the UK-based Campaign for Better Transport, and Beate Kubitz from Beate Kubitz Associates, based in France. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll explore some of the issues related to the development of cycling in rural contexts. The topic is huge, and we're only going to start the conversation and focus it on rural areas, and particularly in the UK and mainly Western Europe today. In writing my book on cycling and micromobility, I was struck by the repeated assumption that much of transport innovation is attempting to provide greater mobility choice to residents of our large cities. Certainly, cities are growing and are economically important, but cycling and micromobility has a number of other opportunities. Yes, this includes leisure and tourism cycling in rural and suburban areas, but also as a core means of rural transport, if the conditions are right and infrastructure and good policies are in place. I see this as a real opportunity to grow mobility choice in these rural areas beyond the usual cases of personal driving, getting car rides from others, taxis, and often limited classic public transport, as well as obviously walking. So how can we develop this market and suggest some tangible first steps to rural authorities and residents? And before I pass to my guests, continue the conversation, I just wanted to show a picture, which is just coming up. There are many good practices in lots of countries around the world, and nothing is standardized in the world of cycling. But on the left, we have it's actually a designated cycle lane in Dorset in southwest London. It's the classic English country lane that you'd experience across this country. In the distance, you can see a car coming at about 40 miles per hour. Key issue, there is no verge, no other place for pedestrians or cyclists to go. And again, this is a designated cycling lane. Something to consider. On the right-hand side, we have a inter-village cycle lane in Alsace in France. Not that this is always perfect, but again, you can see two designated places, one for the roads and the trucks on the right-hand side, one for pedestrians and cyclists on the left. Very separate places for the two user cases. Just to put a bit of visual context into the conversation. But I'd like to pass to my two guests, particularly to start the conversation. So, is my hypothesis of the realistic use of utility cycling in rural areas in the UK, the rest of Europe, is it valid? Do you see particularly issues with it? Let's start with Isabel.
Hi, thank you very much. I would say that yes, we have seen a large focus on towns and cities in the UK in terms of focus on the rollout of cycling infrastructure and the funding that is dedicated for that. And you are seeing that again. We have just released another cycling and walking strategy here in the UK. And again, you see repeatedly the language used is towns and cities. And there is very, very little focus on rural areas. However, I would say there is an increasing amount of support being given to local authorities kind of on the ground in terms of guidance on what cycle infrastructure could and should look like. There is actually some very recent guidance from the DFT on that. But as you say, there is a long way to go. And there are many ways of doing that. Separate is not always better. It offers something different, but hopefully, as we explore today, there are many ways of rolling out cycling infrastructure in rural areas that will be dependent on the needs and demands and capacities of that area. Because as you know, the UK is not Belgium, it is not the Netherlands. Every area is very, very different in terms of topology, geography, population, etc.
Excellent. Beate, what are your thoughts on my hypothesis?
So in my opinion, there is enormous potential for sure in rural cycling, and definitely it's underrepresented in strategies. However, we're seeing in France a recognition that there is potential there, that although cities are definitely at the moment the focus for cycling infrastructure and modal shift, there's a recognition that means that at the moment we have fewer injuries and deaths per kilometre cycled than we do in the rural areas where fewer people are cycling, and that something needs to be done about that. And I think at the moment that sort of inverse relationship between safer towns and cities with more cycling and the rural less safe areas is down to infrastructure and road speeds. And the recognition is that we need to look at how to mitigate those the deficit of infrastructure and the surplus of speed in rural areas, because frankly there is both the commuting, the daily usage of cycling for people who live in rural areas, but also there is a tourist potential and an economic benefit that can be unlocked through looking at what the local road structure or path structure provides and adapting that. I've seen not just enormously the Euro cycle lanes which are growing in our particular area, but also the use of minor roads. Sometimes in Germany you see agricultural roads which are tarmacked and surfaced, but they are no other traffic, and so they're free for cyclists to be used, and they are specifically labelled as no traffic. So looking at roads that are like that as cycle specific roads is definitely something that's happening in Europe, maybe not quite so much in the UK. But yes, I think we definitely have that opportunity and potential if we can seize it.
So I want to come back to you as well, Thomas, but I want to expand the question a bit. I mean, really, what is the state of rural transport in the UK and Europe? And that puts a context, and then as we go forward in the world of cycling. I'll throw in the point that certainly in the UK, the use of rural buses has declined by roughly 20%, roughly since the pandemic. And that's a very long-term decline. So lots of good government initiatives have come along, but it hasn't changed the trajectory of the use of rural transport. There are a whole host of reasons for that occurring. But again, if we're going to have less classic public transport in rural areas, again, the argument could be made that everyone isn't going to cycle, but cycling could be part of the solution for expanding the range of options for people in rural areas. What is the state of rural transport in rural areas in UK, rest of Europe? Thomas, do you maybe you want to start a bit, and then we can go to the other two as well?
For sure. I think there's perhaps Isabel working for the Campaign for Better Transport will provide us with a good overview of at least what's happening in the United Kingdom. More broadly speaking, I mean, there are challenges, budgetary challenges, human resource challenges, other resource challenges with the provision of public transportation, namely buses, or other modes of road transportation in rural areas. There are stories of, only one bus being available for a communal region, having to do many stops. There is a bit of hope. There's some region, notably in the Nordics, that are looking at public transport mobility as a service, so on-demand public transport, which is seen as a technology which can alleviate some of these challenges. So it's demand responsive instead of having to schedule people in rural areas in particular, effectively hail a bus. It's a bit of an odd concept perhaps, but you hail a bus, or you pre-plan or you pre-notify the administration that you'll be intending on traveling on this date, and they provide a more customized schedule. But I think it's only fair to say that, broadly speaking, public transportation in rural areas is in a state. It's in a poor state. It's an overlooked demographic. It's a demographic which doesn't necessarily vote based off public transportation, so the political incentive is limited. But nonetheless, it is definitely a challenging state of affairs when it comes to rural public transportation. Isabel, perhaps you may have a more optimistic view than I do, but that is my broad European perspective.
Yeah, so I would say, echoing what you say, Thomas, it has been since the pandemic, it has been a tough time for bus. I'll focus specifically on bus here because actually in the UK, in many areas, bus is the only form of public transport that would be available. Since the pandemic, ridership has dropped significantly and has begun to grow again, but you are not seeing, in many areas, you're not seeing it back to pre-pandemic figures. You're not. And we actually released a bus service mapping tool over the last month, which shows this. It illustrates the areas that are significantly cut off in terms of bus service. And you see that they're, in central cities, you're getting a far greater service than you are in many of the peripheries. One of the areas of the biggest challenges has been the areas between local authority boundaries, right? So you are in a rural area and you are trying to commute into the next local authority, and for instance, your bus concession ticket might not be valid on the next bus, or the next bus doesn't actually run. It stops at the boundary, it doesn't run. Local government reorganisation is coming up. That has the opportunity to change that. We are seeing combined authorities receiving integrated settlements, which may make that easier to be able to fund many of these bus services in areas that have not received that so far. However, this does presuppose that you would be able to conduct the really joined up planning that is necessary for that, to really integrate the kind of housing development and the transport infrastructure development, which, as Thomas laid out, actually there is a severe deficit of capacity and capability there for local authorities, which will need to be addressed.
Okay, so again, time is marching on. So Beata, I'm going to change the question slightly, but feel free if you want to add any more on issues of rural classic public transport. But actually, what does good rural cycling for utility purposes actually look like? What's almost the vision? And actually also, can e-scooters and other types of bicycles, devices actually be part of that story as well? Beata.
One of the things that's been really interesting in France, in the area local to me, which is a very rural area on the edge between the Mediterranean and the end of the Pyrenees, is seeing the road structure is so well maintained that we do see small e-scooters being used for people to travel between villages of 1 to 5 kilometre distances. So that's really interesting that a well-maintained road surface can unlock much more sustainable travel habits. There's also a real focus on locality in France. Although we have a national Plan Vélo, which is a €2 billion fund for developing bike modal shift, the real progress is in localities and within communes, which really have power over their road structure. So to give you an example, I recently visited a commune on the edge of Perpignan, so surrounded by fields, a rural area where the high school was decided to create a travel to school plan, and that involved cycling around with their pupils to look at the local road network and see if it's suitable for cycling to school. And then making a plan and asking the locality to fix any negative points, any spots where there was severance or they considered it dangerous for the children. And because in France, if you have a commune, they have control over most of the roads within their locality, that's a reasonably easy fix. It's something that very much on the local government structure, but that was a quite impressive project where the school built 400 cycle spots for parking bikes, and they were full within 18 months, which is half of the pupils in the school were able to cycle to school through this initiative. So that, in my view, was a very good example of getting people onto bikes within a rural area, and giving kids a sense of independence, and the teachers were very happy that the pupils are turning up at school with that exercise under their belts already for the day. So it was generally a very positive scheme that involved lots of life skills, like learning how to sort of maintain your bicycle and ride yourself to school and things like that.
No, really excellent. Again, it puts a context of localism, local solutions, but actually working with the community to come together as a solution that actually meets the needs of the community. Clearly, I'm sure the other two have thoughts they'd like to add. But I'd throw it also to the point of infrastructure. There are many kinds of infrastructure for cycling in cities, in rural areas. But thinking about the local infrastructure and what would really work for the community that you're actually dealing with. And although we talk about classic public transport, cycling, it's walking as well. Walking and cycling clearly work closely together, and they're often different infrastructures, classic England country walks with styles and so on. But can you put out infrastructure that supports pedestrian activity, walking to school, as well as cycling to school? And the quality of the infrastructure. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be safe, dry, perhaps lit between local villages. But certainly provides assurance that in the twilight evenings you're not going to be thrown by a pothole or a cow or something that actually blocks the road, or a flood, or a flooding along the route. Quality infrastructure, predictable infrastructure, connected infrastructure, walking and cycling also working together, and safety. Isabel Van Thomas, what does good look like in terms of rural cycling?
I think I would start from kind of thinking about what the goal is. I think good cycling infrastructure looks like something which is the end goal is mode shift. So this is where I think the conversation about micromobility does kind of require a bit more analysis, because I think that the question for a lot of people there is, we are not saying we do not want e-scooters or e-bikes, because I think they are incredibly valued and valuable for a huge section of the population. Young people getting to work, getting to school, getting to university, etc. Older people who no longer wish or no longer can ride a conventional bike without electric assistance. But it is about what journeys they are replacing. Are they replacing somebody who was going to walk anyway? Then, what is the value? What is the added value there? And, what are we trying to create? Fine. The second is, thinking about, as I said, what the end goal is. The end goal should be mode shift. We are wanting more people to travel by bike. And so does the infrastructure development fit with some of the softer measures you're taking that are, subsidizing bike share, subsidizing purchasing bike, cycle to work schemes, etc. They really need to work in tandem, because actually, we talk about cycling in the UK and France, and the difference is they both have the same mode share for cycling. It is 2% in urban areas, 1% in rural areas. In the UK, 1% of people cycling for their main journeys. And I think that needs to be at the back of a decision maker's mind. What is going to be the outcome?
Excellent. Thomas, your thoughts? What does good
I,
look like?
I think what good looks like is a very localized approach in many ways, and I mean a communal approach, and perhaps in the French way. I think some great examples were outlined where local authorities can make on-the-spot decisions to improve infrastructure. That's only half the story. By way of example, let's say in that village where the school undertook efforts to ensure that cycling, students could cycle. If there's a farmer who has a dog that's not on a leash or on a lead, and he attacks cyclists passing by, which is an experience I've had on multiple occasions cycling in rural Portugal, that is detrimental to the overall objective of getting people cycling. And in light of that, I think you need to really have local participation and a certain amount of acceptance of the rules, regulations, and norms around changing cycling habits, changing transport modes, and that includes everyone from the farmer who has a guard dog off a lead or a leash during the day, who can attack cyclists as they pass by. It's for agricultural road users, so big agricultural vehicles are scary for cyclists and pedestrians alike, with ensuring that they do provide the meter and a half of space as required by law. It's ensuring that the local police, the municipal police, going from a French perspective, also ensure that road users are safe and enforce local traffic rules. It's not just about the stick either. It's also ensuring that people understand why we need to change a few things in order to make the life of cyclists better, but also recognizing and potentially arguing that today they may not be a cyclist, but when they do become a cyclist, if they do become a cyclist, they would appreciate those changes. So good for me is good infrastructure, but it's really above all good community buy-in and a holistic approach, which of course can be ideal. It is idealistic, but I think it is necessary if we want people to feel comfortable in cycling in rural communities.
Excellent. So I'm going to move on to the next question, but I just wanted to throw in one other point, and it came out particularly in writing the book. Also, I just stressed there are many kinds of cyclists. We talked about classic cyclists, e-scooters. Trikes are another one, particularly as you get into older communities. So the three-wheeled bicycle, which might have a pannier in the back. Key issue, it's wider. It takes more space, probably a little less mobile. So local authorities, rural areas, particularly less kind of more narrow streets, do you consider you might have wider vehicles and might need wider infrastructure? And how do you think about that in the design of the infrastructure you put forward? But to move the conversation, so is this about financing? Is this about funding for local authorities, regional authorities, communes? Or is this about political will? Is this about having a leader in your commune, region, province, whatever, who says rural cycling is important? You can't do everything. Where is the key lever to make this happen? And I'll probably head to Frats and Beati to start.
I mean, I think in France you always start with the commune, because there are 35,000 mayors in France and 30,000 of them are in rural areas, and you do genuinely have a lot of power over your commune. And you need to leave the front door in order to be able to get out on a bike. What happens when you get beyond the boundary of the commune? That's when things become more complicated, because then you start to have to engage in negotiations with the neighbouring commune or the département to look at what happens on the departmental routes or more broadly. But that involves political will as much as it involves finances, because when things are a complex patchwork of land ownership or land responsibility, to create a route is obviously more tricky and more difficult. Even with political will, there are other landowners to consider. I think one of the easier wins in a lot of ways is slowing down rural roads, because one of the massive problems is that roads have speeded up over time as cars have got faster and traffic has got heavier, and we haven't necessarily changed those speed limits to meet to try and create a feeling of safety in the road infrastructure for all users. And I think there is genuinely becoming a recognition that it's not just about getting cars from A to B as quickly as possible. It is about the rights of other road users to exist on rural roads, and tackling that bringing road speeds down can also opens up the safety, increases the safety for other road users, and just creating a different expectation about what a rural road is quite an interesting part of the network options. And obviously, if you can make roads safer for everyone, then your wider vehicles, your e-cargo bikes, your trikes, your things like that become part of the traffic. I don't think it's one solution fits all, but that's definitely one of the pieces.
Excellent. So Thomas, I'll go to you, and then Isabel, come back to you, perhaps more of a UK focus in some of the governance issues we face in this country. Thomas, is it financial or is it political will?
It's a combination of both. It always is. When there are highly localized politics, as has been discussed in the example of France, mayors and elected officials are ultimately responsible, and they feel responsible. When government feels far, it feels far from the people in both directions, which I think limits the voice of the people and those who want to cycle. It also limits perceived responsibility. So that's where the political will exists. I think government structures influence political will, they influence the impact of political will on the structure itself. And it's a beautiful cycle, if you wish. But financing does matter. It makes no sense to ask a commune that has tax revenues of 150,000 euros a year to finance a 500 million euro cycle park. That would be ridiculous. But I think financing is necessary, but it's not the biggest issue at hand. Rural communities are extremely resilient. They are extremely skilled. People generally want to give into their communities. They want to give what they can. If that's not money, that can be their time. There's ways of ensuring that community-driven projects exist whilst ensuring that they're not overly costly. So I think mobilizing the community, especially if there is political will, is possible. And that can overcome some of the financial constraints, although of course not all.
And over to Isabel. So, I mean, clearly in the UK, we have some devolved responsibilities, and that is evolving, so to speak, as we speak. Is this a huge opportunity or a setback, or is it just about more money from the DFT and central government?
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of everything, isn't it? This is a fantastic opportunity to be putting, as Thomas says, the decision making at a level, where local authorities have the ability to see what is needed in what area, and we are seeing that. For example, in areas, like Blackpool, that were previously, very, quite low income areas that struggled to make investment in some of the transport infrastructure that was necessarily needed. We're seeing fantastic investment in active travel there. And actually, so what we have now is we have, a clear trajectory where local authorities are going to receive more powers, and therefore it's not necessarily about more funding, but more freedom to spend those funds on what they wish. I think the problem being there is ensuring that though things like active travel, and I would say public transport as well, are able to compete in those integrated settlements, so that it doesn't get there. So it's all well and good saying to a local authority, you can spend this money as you wish, and then they turn around and say, well, actually, we don't want to fund our new cycle lane anymore. Actually, we would quite like to use it to fund this. It is making sure those funds are still available for those things, which is necessary. And I think, just coming back to what Beate said about the lowering the speed limits on roads, I think if I was a local authority, I might say, actually, that is not necessarily, for me, politically a low-hanging fruit, because we do see local authorities getting massive pushback when they try and do that. But we have seen Wales do that and achieve that. And there's, this classic curve that happens when we talk about congestion charging as well, that there's, big, steep increase in people rejecting the idea, and then this plateaus and goes down when people realize, actually, this is fantastic and this is how they want their streets to look. So actually, that is a fantastic way forward, and as long as we can kind of push through that, that can be successful.
So I think, Thomas, you raised your hand, and I'm going to pass it back to Beate as well. But Thomas.
Indeed. On the question of money, I think some regions would be surprised of how much money actually exists, particularly at the European level. The EU puts hundreds of millions of euros available for local projects. The real challenge is accessing those funds. It's local communes, communities, small villages do not have the technical capacity required to apply for grants, low interest loans. So I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help local communities, be it rural cycling or other projects, is actually help them get one or two experts that can link them with the finances, help them apply for those projects. I know that they exist elsewhere. I know in the EU, a lot of officials at the European Commission complain, saying that they have too much money and they don't know how to disperse it because there's not enough applications. So if we really want to help local communities, it's actually helping them get access to the money, which is already there.
Excellent. And Beate, did you want to add any more on this topic, particularly from your experience in the UK? You lived here for many years.
I think the UK experience is different from in France because there are more land ownership issues, I think, in the UK. So trying to find alternative routes and safe ways, and apart from the previously used railway network where railway lines have been closed, those quite often provide rights of way and passages that can be used as alternative routes. I mean, money is definitely an issue, but it is often, much more often, it's the political framework that exists for spending money and the land ownership framework that exists for laying new tracks that impede and slow down progress. And that's something that I found, you know, trying to have local cycle lanes in rural country, in rural areas in the UK has been the most frustrating thing. Is you have to go to Westminster, or you have had to go to Westminster to be allowed to spend money on doing that.
Okay, so I'm going to push time is marching on. There's lots to cover on this topic. But I want to push the debate forward into the classic question of who else do we need to work with? Obviously, we need to work with the local authorities. But are there key partners, ways of looking at this slightly differently, which I think we were getting into, where there is a real opportunity to bring somebody else into the conversation and push forward this agenda and obviously build political will? And the one I'd throw in is youth unemployment. People not getting job experiences. Clearly, if a young person, or even not a young person, can't get to the next village to work in that pub or work in the library or the bank or whatever, and access that job because they don't have the finances to have a car or they don't have parents to drive them or all those kinds of issues, and clearly they can't use a taxi every day. Cycling could possibly be that way of expanding their job horizons and allowing them to get the access to those jobs or even healthcare and other things like that. So I'd argue that don't just think about it in terms of classic just cycling or just going to the shops. It really can be quite important around youth empowerment, youth employment, job experiences. There clearly are a low range of other partnerships, but again, I'll go across the panel again. Perhaps starting again with Isabel. Who else do you think is critical to bring on board in this kind of debate?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's often missed off about this, we talk a lot about cycling education, learning to cycle, etc. There are some fantastic organisations like Micromobility Trust who do this. But I think specifically in rural areas as well, maintenance of a bike is a really critical issue. If I am somebody who doesn't often cycle and would like to get into cycling, one of my biggest fears might be I will be stuck in the middle of the road with a puncture and I don't know how to fix that. And so therefore, actually, for me, that is not an option because I am actually too afraid to do that. But there are some fantastic organisations that provide free or very low cost kind of cycle maintenance activities, classes, etc. There are some really interesting formats for this. They can go into schools, they can go into kind of local town squares and set up events. I've seen it done in many, many different ways. And some of the interesting things that these organizations and enterprises offer is there is a big kind of community engagement angle to that. I've seen it in many areas where it is a really interesting route to enabling newcomers to a country to do that. In fact, there are many organisations in Canada at this, many initiatives that have been set up to allow and to educate new migrants to maintain their bikes, and at the end of it, often they've built their own bike, which is fantastic, and it's a real way to engage people in the value of cycling and to dissipate that fear around maintaining a bike, which I think is really, really important, specifically in rural areas.
Okay, great. So Thomas, any kind of low-hanging partners you think we really need to bring on board and kind of change the debate?
Yes, I think when we talk about modal shift, people like us sometimes need to take a bit of humble pie and recognize that for non-cyclists, a bicycle is scary. An e-bike, though, as I've seen, and at least anecdotally, is a bit less scary. When we look at rural cycling, distances might be longer than urban environments. The terrain might be less even. And e-bikes, particularly robust ones, cargo e-bikes at times, provide that hybrid between a motorcycle, a car, and a bicycle, which puts people at ease. Especially if you need to go into work and you don't want to go to work completely sweaty, or if it's dark and you feel more comfortable on a heavier e-bike that has integrated illumination. E-bikes, however, especially quality ones, are expensive. And where I would focus on is making cycling more accessible financially for individuals who are considering cycling. I think there's the Bike to Work scheme in the UK, which I think has worked quite well, at least in an urban environment. I don't know if it's worked well in a rural one, but there must be different mechanisms, be it through financial institutions, local government, through employers. Sometimes taxation incentives as well. There's a lot of countries where you have a tax incentive to provide your employee a car, but also applying that to public transportation and or micromobility and cycling, I think could be extremely useful in order to get people cycling, especially once that infrastructure, at least a certain level of infrastructure, exists in an area or region. That I think is the real advantage.
And Beati, partnerships.
Oh, absolutely. I think employers are a great partnership. In Germany as well, you have a similar scheme where people can lease bikes and pay for them over the duration of their lives, the bike's life, and that works for e-bikes too. So again, and e-bikes are just such an opener upper of access to bicycles to people from every age and walk of life, and to enable, in the heat wave, do you really want to be straining up a hill? An e-bike really does help alleviate all sorts of issues if you're in more adverse circumstances. But then, as other partnerships, I'm thinking also schools, like the partnership, the targeting pupils cycling to work, they're learning skills that they will have for the rest of their lives, including in the school that I was talking about in Toulouse, in the outskirts of Perpignan, that they were learning bike maintenance as part of their as part of their cycle to work kind of scheme, and employers again, and then also having bike libraries, I think, is a really interesting concept. Back in, it was the early 2013 or something like that, 2014, we had some how to share bicycles project at what's now Como UK, and we were looking at different models. And some of the models that were very useful were having bike libraries that enable people to try out a bike for going to a new job, or try out a bike for going to interviews, and having those as publicly supported schemes, and then also cycling as part of a healthcare regime. So prescribing cycling as part of getting fit and getting healthier, and having more movement in your life as a way of being more healthy, is definitely a potential partnership. And then finally, I think the thing that we mustn't ever leave out, particularly in rural areas, is tourism. Because if we can get people onto bikes when they're on holiday, they're doing something different out of their everyday. They're often more open to doing new and different things. And if you say, You know, for instance, the Isle of Wight is much more accessible on a bicycle than it is in a car. You're going to be able to see other things that you wouldn't have seen if you were driving everywhere. It's opening up access. It's giving people something that's different, and it's giving them some different skills as well on top of that. So I would definitely advocate tourism and visitor attractions being a potential way of getting people onto bicycles.
Excellent. We'll come back to velotourism. It's such an enormous market in a future webinar. We're getting close to the end, so I just want to go to this question, and it's a bit kind of difficult but odd, but I think it's really important to say it up front. Can rural cycling, rural utility cycling, ever be considered a safe mode? I think, I mean, that is a very kind of couched or kind of ill-defined word as safe, but I think people listening to this webinar will take a view on what that means. So I think we just need a few words from each of the panelists on how you would address that question. I think we've talked about it in a number of ways through the whole webinar, but let's just come front and center back to, can rural utility cycling be considered a safe mode? Who wants to start? Isabel, I think you're writing, so I'll pass to you first. I will add something at the very end, but go ahead.
Yeah, this is something I spent a lot of time thinking about, just because, as you said, safe is such a subjective way of looking at our relationship with travel and with the road. I think that actually the continuation of this idea that cycling is not safe has actually played into the hands of a car lobby that says you are safe when you are driving your car and no other way. So I think that is, you know, a big issue there. I also think that there is an issue about seeing cycling as a solution to safety, particularly around women and girls as well. Often it's, you know, there are conversations that say it's safer for women and girls to cycle because they do not want to walk after dark. And I think that actually that's a justification for not addressing the problem at the root. So I think that what is necessarily needed is a recognition that, you know, so many people do not feel safe cycling, and you can tell them it's safe until the cows come home, but they're still not, that doesn't change the fact they're not going to feel safe. Then expanding that and saying, okay, so what is it that would make you feel safe, and what are the things that are making you feel unsafe? And let's have a discussion. This sounds like a very academic answer, but let's have a discussion about why those things, thoughts and feelings and, you know, real experiences exist and what we can do to mitigate them. Because I think a lot of them are necessary, you know, they are real visceral experiences, but a lot of them are this feeling with that you will be unsafe without necessarily understanding ways to make yourself safe.
Excellent. Beate.
Absolutely. Safe compared to what is my question. I mean, yes, it is less safe in rural areas to cycle compared to urban areas, that's for sure. But is it less safe than any other activity? I mean, this is the issue, and I do think that we are in a sort of point where there's a bit of a cultural shift. If you learn, like I was brought up cycling from a very young age. My dad's German. That's the way German children are brought up. So I find it very hard to conceptualize cycling as unsafe, because I've always felt safe on a bicycle, safe from, maybe not quite as safe sometimes as I'd like to be, but safe compared to being a lone woman walking after dark, as Isabel was saying, and safe compared to other activities. So yes, statistically, maybe not as safe as urban cycling, but it can be safe compared to, you know, other things that people do. We all do things that are probably not quite as safe as we think they are. Yeah, and we should, you know, and that doesn't let us off the hook from trying to make it safer. And that just want to be absolutely clear about that. It's I really do think we need to make it feel safer, and we actually need to make it safer. But those are measures that we should take as a society, because the kids are learning to cycle. You know, if you look at the ground shift children are being encouraged to cycle to school more than they were in my generation. I was an anomaly, but now you're seeing these shifts where it's changing. They're not going to put up with shoddy infrastructure when they move beyond their commune or their school run.
Thomas, safety.
I have an aviation background, at least academically. And the 1940s and 50s and 60s, when jet aviation was starting to become popular, it was horrendously unsafe. Today, in the 2025, 2026, more people die from falling out of bed than taking a plane. Or you're more likely to die from a bumblebee than being in a plane accident. There's a reason why that happened. There's a reason why there was a shift. Aviation became one of the safest ways of traveling in the world because of a cultural shift within the industry regarding safety. Cycling is a bit different because it's more decentralized in aviation or rail transport or maritime transport. You have more people involved, you have more stakeholders, you have more interactions. That being said, we cannot strive for that. It doesn't mean that we cannot strive for that level of safety through education and a general cultural shift. We discussed it throughout today. You ensure that your infrastructure is sound. You ensure that the local policemen do enforce the traffic laws. Maybe we talk about reducing speed on some areas. Maybe it's about the separation of infrastructure. Maybe it's about teaching people to have a safe and well-maintained bike through community projects. Maybe it's about visibility. Maybe it's about driver awareness. Maybe it's about ensuring that no dogs come out and attack you as you cycle by a farm. All these changes can make cycling safer. And I think when pushed to the extreme, it can make cycling in a rural environment genuinely and objectively safe, or just as safe as riding a motorbike, taking a walk, or even driving a car. I've been on some of those rural roads in England and Ireland. I wouldn't necessarily consider driving a car very safe, especially under the former speed limits, which I think went up to 80 kilometers an hour in Ireland until quite recently. These small changes do make a difference, and so I think we can make it safe.
Excellent. So we're just coming to the final question, but I just wanted to add on to this question in terms of safety. I think as we've seen in urban settings, on safer streets or community streets, healthy streets, lots of different definitions. In rural areas, we need a holistic view of roads as well, and rural, particularly two-lane roads. And as planners, as local authorities, as transport activists, to think, yes, they're for cars and they're for trucks, but where in the design is the space for these other modes who are equally valid, equally have a right for mobility for a whole host of reasons. And that might mean a dedicated other thing, it might mean a bit of space on the side, it might mean a redesign, it might mean many things in different contexts. But I think that actually comes back to the safety point. And it'll come to be the final question. We can't change everything at once. We're not going to redesign every rural road in the UK in one decade or one parliament. But starting to put that into the basic designs of roads, I think is critical to allow rural cycling. But rural pedestrians and just rural mobility to actually be valid. So I'd like to go around one final round, final thoughts. And within your final thoughts, key point for local authorities to do. They can do many things. We talked about many things. The one or two things they really need to focus in on. And let's start with Beate, and as well as your final thoughts for the overall.
Okay, so my baseline is baselining. I really feel that one of the things that we haven't done systematically is to have digital audits of appropriate infrastructure so that you can even see where the gaps are at the moment. I think that we are if you use any kind of journey planner, it always comes with the kind of warning that it may not actually be a route that you can walk or cycle on. And so I think that the very base level is that we need to have an audit of what routes are safe or have some kind of infrastructure that will enable you to walk or cycle on them before we start anything else. And interestingly, the local department in the Pyrenees Oriental, where I live, has started to catalogue its entire cycle infrastructure and put it on OpenStreetMaps. So there is an officially audited map of what cycle infrastructure exists for the entire department that is accessible to everyone. And I think that's a really good model for starting to show where there is good infrastructure and where the gaps are, and then we can build from there.
Thank you, Beate. Isabel, final thoughts and local authorities.
So I would echo what Beate said there, because actually on that, from a local authority point of view, you can't apply, coming back to our conversation about getting funding, you can't get that funding unless you know what you have and you can illustrate what you have. So therefore, it is the first step to getting that funding, to say, this is what we got and this is what we want, and here it is. So I would 100% echo that. That is what needs to happen. Second is a much better kind of understanding of where you want what you want your cycle infrastructure to serve. So we know that you're never going to have a cycle lane all the way across every single kind of village to every single other village. We're not going to get that, but you do want a piece of cycle infrastructure to connect you from A to B to where that individual is going. So really thinking about, if I have X amount of money, X amount of capacity, what do I really want to connect? That could be the local shop, that could be the local school, that could be the local bus stop. Thinking about more integrated transport infrastructure, but really having an idea of what do we want to connect. Yeah.
Excellent. Thomas.
I'm going to be a bit scandalous, and I think it echoes a little bit what has been said, but I think local authorities and authorities in general need to dare to listen. In this context, I think there's a lot of people out there that are willing to cycle, maybe on an e-bike, maybe on an e-scooter. They're willing to forego the car on a number of trips in order to go see their mate at the pub down the street or in the next village. Listen to them, talk with them, don't talk to them, but talk with them, outline where their challenges are, assess where the infrastructure gaps are, see where their pain points are. Maybe they would love to get a brand new electric bike that costs £5,000 or €5,000 and they can't afford that, and they need some financing. Maybe their kids have something. Listen to them and build it based off what they need. And once you build it, more people will likely come and join them as well. So dare to listen, take a step back and dare to listen. That's my conclusion.
Excellent. And my final thought before I pass to Thomas to conclude the webinar is, clearly education, partnerships, all and other aspects very important. But when it comes back to infrastructure, almost as Isabella was saying, don't try and change everything at once. Don't assume you have to do 500 kilometers across your local authority in the next 5 years or nothing will change. Focus in on some of those key origins and destinations where you can make a difference and show a difference to your local authority, to your population, to your stakeholders. Link the end of the suburbia with the next village that's only 1.5 kilometers away, with quality lit infrastructure that demonstrates that pedestrian cyclists are part of the solution, are a real mode, and can actually have high quality journeys, and use that as a way of then building out over a period of time realistic infrastructure that changes the mobility options for your community. But start focused, listen, and build a realistic and relative network over time. There's much more we could talk about. I had to cut out some of the questions, otherwise we'd be here all afternoon. But hopefully, again, to the audience, hopefully you've had some insights, some snippets, some perspectives that might change your view on the importance of rural suburban cycling and how you can bring it into your thinking of mobility. But with that note, I shall pass it to Thomas to finish off the webinar.
Well, thank you, Giles, Isabel, and Beate for this truly insightful conversation. As I mentioned earlier, this discussion is part of our wider project and our recently published book, Can Cycling and Micromobility Deliver a Modern and Sustainable City?, published by our team at the Green Mobility magazine and authored by Giles Bailey. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would invite all of our listeners to order a copy of the book, which is not only available on Amazon, but also at a number of leading bookstores in Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, and across Europe as well. If you have any reactions to any of the points made during the discussion, or would like to share your views on rural cycling or cycling in general, please do leave a comment on our social media pages, or you can write to us at editor@ibexpub.media. Thank you again for joining us, and we truly look forward to welcoming you at the next session.